Humiliated in front of everyone for not hearing, he lived shut off from the world, until a lonely goat changed everything. And what happens next will leave you speechless. The sun had not yet appeared on the horizon when Anthony Benton, or simply Tony as everyone knew him, was already up. The wooden floorboards creaked under his bare feet as he made his way to the kitchen of the old house on Good Hope Farm. His movements were precise, the result of decades repeating the same routine. The wood stove was lit with mastery, and soon the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the room. At 52, Tony carried deep lines on his face, silent witnesses to a life of hard work. Since the age of 8, when a violent fever had deprived him of his hearing, he had learned to live in a world without sounds, but that never prevented him from feeling, and feeling deeply. Through the window, he observed the mist that covered the mountains of Stone Creek like a protective cloak. That piece of Virginia was his private universe, a place where silence represented not absence but presence. As he sipped his hot coffee, his eyes surveyed the property he knew like the back of his hand. Good Hope Farm wasn't large or luxurious, but for Tony it was everything. Inherited from his grandfather, who had received it from his father, the land had passed through generations of calloused hands and hearts devoted to work. The small organic plantation, the well-cared-for animals, and the artisanal cheese he produced were his pride and livelihood. After finishing his coffee, he headed to the barn. The chickens clucked around him, a sound he couldn't hear but whose vibration he knew well. He fed them carefully, collected the eggs, and checked if there was fresh water for all the animals. Each animal received individualized attention, like members of a silent family that communicated through looks and gestures. It was during this morning routine that Tony noticed something different. Near the northern fence of the property, the damp mud displayed marks that didn't belong to any of his animals, unknown footprints. Frowning, he decided to investigate after finishing his usual tasks. The sun was already high when he finally headed to the location. The barbed wire fence, installed by himself years ago, seemed to have been forced in some spots. Following the marks on the ground, he found something he didn't expect. Tangled in the wires and surrounded by pieces of cardboard was a thin, injured goat. The animal trembled, its eyes reflecting fear and pain, but there was something more. There, an almost defiant gleam, a spark of life that refused to be extinguished. Without hesitation, Tony approached with slow movements so as not to frighten it further. With firm but gentle hands, he began to free the animal from the wire that imprisoned it. The goat tried to back away but was too weak to offer resistance. When he finally freed it, Tony took it carefully in his arms. The animal weighed less than it should. Its coat was dirty and tangled, and small wounds marked its body. Back at the house, he improvised a shelter on the porch, using old crates and fresh straw. He cleaned the animal's wounds with warm water and applied natural ointments. He kept for emergencies. Throughout the process, he talked to the goat even without hearing his own voice. He knew that the serene tone of his words could calm the frightened animal. "You'll be fine here, buddy," he murmured, observing how the goat gradually relaxed under his care. "I'll call you Whisper." The name came spontaneously, contrasting with the animal's rustic appearance. A discreet smile formed on Tony's usually serious face. There was something about that goat that touched a sensitive chord in his heart. In the following hours, he prepared a nutritious mixture of leaves and grains to strengthen the debilitated animal. Whisper accepted the food eagerly, as if understanding that he was in good hands. When night fell over the mountains, Tony looked one last time at his new companion before retiring. In the darkness of the silent farm, man and animal seemed to find mutual comfort in each other's presence. Neither could imagine how that casual encounter would forever change the course of their lives, and of the quiet town at the foot of the mountain. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The following days brought a remarkable transformation in Whisper. The goat, once fragile and distrustful, recovered with surprising speed. His wounds healed well, and his gaze, once fearful, now shone with an almost comical vivacity when Tony approached. The routine at Good Hope Farm took on a new rhythm. Every morning after preparing his coffee, Tony would find Whisper already awake, waiting for him on the porch. The animal had abandoned the improvised shelter and chosen a specific corner of the house to sleep, as if claiming his place in that small universe. "Good morning, buddy," Tony would greet, with a pat on the animal's head. To his surprise, Whisper began to follow him in his daily tasks. While Tony watered the garden, the goat remained nearby, attentively observing each movement. During the milking of the goats, he would position himself at the entrance of the barn, like an unlikely supervisor. During the harvest of vegetables for the weekly farmer's market, he accompanied each step of the farmer with a loyalty that Tony had never experienced before. On cold nights, sitting on the porch under the starry Virginia sky, the man contemplated the mountains while Whisper rested beside him. The silence that enveloped them was not empty. It was full of complicity. "You know, Whisper, you appeared at the right time," he commented one night, his fingers caressing the now clean and shiny coat of the animal. "Sometimes we need company without even knowing it." Saturday arrived, market day in the small central square of Stone Creek. Tony woke up even earlier, carefully preparing his week's production: fresh cheeses, organic vegetables, free-range eggs, and homemade jams. It was from there that his livelihood came, from selling these products to local residents and tourists who visited the mystic town. When everything was ready to depart, Whisper appeared at the barn door, as if waiting for an invitation to accompany him. "You want to go to the market?" asked Tony, surprised. The goat shook his head, almost seeming like an affirmative response. "All right, but behave yourself." The journey to town was made by wagon, pulled by Old Thunder the horse. During the entire trip, Whisper remained seated next to Tony, observing the mountain landscape with apparent interest. The winding curves of the dirt road revealed at each instant a new angle of that piece of rural Virginia. In the town square, the unusual presence of Whisper didn't go unnoticed. Children approached curiously, wanting to touch the animal. Adults smiled, intrigued by the scene of the deaf farmer and his vigilant goat. Mrs. Connie, an elderly lady who sold crafts at the neighboring stall, was the first to comment. "Tony, I see you've got yourself a helper," she spoke slowly, gesturing to facilitate understanding. He smiled in response and nodded, proud. Whisper, as if understanding they were talking about him, perked up slightly, drawing laughter from those present. The morning proceeded peacefully. Tony's products, known for their quality, sold quickly. Whisper remained close, attentive to every movement around the stall. He seemed especially vigilant when strangers approached, as if assuming the role of an improvised bodyguard. It was around noon that the tranquility was interrupted. A shiny, black imported car parked near the square, completely out of place in the simple landscape of the historic town. The vehicle attracted curious looks and some whispers among the vendors. From within the automobile emerged a tall man, wearing an impeccably tailored suit. His shiny shoes reflected the sun as he walked confidently among the stalls. Behind him, another younger man carried a leather briefcase and was noting something on a tablet. "Ladies and gentlemen, good morning," he announced in a loud voice, capturing everyone's attention. "My name is Roger Blackwood from Blackwood Enterprises. I'm here to bring progress to our beloved Stone Creek." The vendors exchanged uncertain glances. Visitors like him rarely brought good news for small producers like them. Roger continued his speech as he walked among the stalls, examining everything with a look that mixed curiosity and disdain. When he reached Tony's stall, he stopped suddenly. His eyes scanned the artisanal products and then focused on the simple man who sold them. "And you must be?" he asked directly. Tony, concentrated on wrapping a cheese for a customer, didn't notice the question. Whisper, however, raised his head and fixed his gaze on the well-dressed stranger, his ears slightly tilted back in a subtle sign of distrust. "Hey, I'm talking to you," insisted Roger, raising his voice. Mrs. Connie intervened quickly. "He's deaf, mister. He's Tony from Good Hope Farm." A strange gleam passed through Roger's eyes upon hearing the name of the farm. His rehearsed smile gained a different dimension, almost predatory. He looked at his assistant and made a discreet gesture, which was answered with a quick note on the tablet. "Interesting, very interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to others. What none of them could imagine at that moment was that casual encounter at the Saturday market marked the beginning of a silent battle that would echo far beyond the mountains of Stone Creek. The sun had already reached its highest point when Roger Blackwood, after circling the market and talking with some people, returned to Tony's stall. This time, his countenance had lost any trace of cordiality. He approached with firm steps, followed closely by the assistant, who never took his eyes off the tablet. "So this is the famous deaf man of the mountain," he said loudly, gesturing in an exaggerated and unnecessary manner. "They say your land is the most fertile in the region." Tony, perceiving the man's presence through movement and shadows, raised his gaze. His eyes, accustomed to reading intentions, immediately captured the arrogant posture of the visitor. He made a slight nod, a simple greeting he offered to everyone. Roger smiled sideways, turning to the small group of curious onlookers that was beginning to form around them. "Don't you find it fascinating?" he continued, pointing to Tony as if he were a circus attraction. "A man who can't hear, living alone on that old farm. It must be like living in the last century. No television, no music, no conversations. A true hermit." Some people laughed. Nervously, others averted their gaze, embarrassed by the situation. Mrs. Connie frowned, visibly uncomfortable. "You shouldn't talk like that." "Tony is a respected man here," she warned, with the authority that her 70 years gave her. "Respected?" Roger laughed, completely ignoring the elderly lady's reprimand. "Look at him. Worn clothes, calloused hands, and on top of that, deaf. As a post, how does someone like that manage to keep such a valuable property?" Tony didn't need to hear to understand that he was being ridiculed. The expression of the man in the suit, the contained laughter around him, the visible discomfort. On familiar faces, everything communicated more than words could. He felt his face heating up, but remained impassive with the dignity he had always carried. "And this ridiculous goat follows you everywhere?" continued Roger, approaching Whisper with a brusque gesture. "Is he your bodyguard? Or maybe he's the only company that agrees to live with a—" He couldn't finish the sentence. With a sudden movement that took everyone by surprise, Whisper advanced toward Roger and delivered a well-aimed headbutt to his leg. It wasn't strong enough to seriously hurt him, but the unexpected impact made the businessman lose his balance. Hands stagger backward, almost falling onto the neighboring stall. A momentary silence took over the square, soon replaced by discreet laughter and even some spontaneous applause. Roger's face transformed into a mask of fury and humiliation. "That animal should be put down," he vociferated, straightening his wrinkled suit. "And as for you—" He pointed to Tony, who remained calm, with only a shadow of a smile on his lips. "I will meet again." With those words, he spun on his heels and walked away with large strides, followed by the dazed assistant who tried to keep up. The black car started with a strident noise, leaving a cloud of dust behind. When the dust settled, Mrs. Connie approached Tony and lightly touched his arm. "That man is up to no good," she said slowly, so he could read her lips. "Be careful." "Tony?" He nodded, thanking her for the advice with a gesture. He stooped to pet Whisper, who had returned to his vigilant position as if nothing had happened. The goat's eyes, however, remained fixed in the direction where the car had departed. The rest of the market proceeded without further incidents, but something had changed. The looks directed at Tony mixed admiration, concern, and curiosity. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town, growing with each new person who told it. By the end of the day, the story had already transformed into a kind of local fable. The humble deaf farmer and his brave goat facing the powerful businessman from the city. On the journey back to Good Hope Farm, Tony felt an unusual weight in his chest. Years of voluntary isolation had sharpened his intuition, and something told him that the encounter was not casual. Whisper, seated beside him in the wagon, seemed to share this disquiet. When they arrived home, Tony noticed something different. The main gate was ajar, although he was sure he had closed it before leaving. He got down from the wagon cautiously and approached slowly. Whisper accompanied him, tense and alert. On the packed earth, tire marks that weren't there in the morning. Someone had visited the farm during his absence. Tony felt a chill run down his spine as he inspected the property. Nothing seemed to have been taken or damaged, but the sensation of invasion was undeniable. On one of the fence posts, he found something that confirmed his suspicions: a small folded paper held by a rusty nail. With slightly trembling hands, he unfolded the paper and read the message written in impersonal capital letters. "This land is worth more than you imagine. Sell while you can." Tony took a deep breath, crumpled the paper and put it in his pocket. He looked at the horizon where the sun was beginning to set behind the mountains that had always protected him. For the first time in many years, he felt that the silence around him was no longer just his faithful companion. It had transformed into something threatening. Whisper leaned against his leg, as if wanting to remind him that he wasn't alone. Tony crouched down and hugged the animal, finding comfort in its warmth and loyalty. "We'll be fine, friend," he whispered, more to himself than to the goat. "This land is our home, and nobody is going to take it from us." The week following the incident at the market brought growing unease for Tony. Every day, as he walked his property, he found subtle signs of intrusion: a forced fence, unknown, footprints, and worse, new threatening notes scattered at strategic points around the farm. "Money or trouble, choose quickly. No one will hear your screams up here. Last chance, sell or suffer the consequences." Each message more aggressive than the previous one. Tony collected the papers carefully, keeping them as silent evidence of the persecution he was suffering. Whisper, always attentive, rarely strayed from his owner, as if sensing the imminent danger. On a particularly cold morning, Tony discovered something that made his blood freeze. Scattered among the beds of his garden, rudimentary traps made with tensioned wires, strategically positioned to injure anyone who passed by. Fortunately, Whisper had hesitated before entering the area, alerting Tony with his unusual behavior. With hands trembling from contained anger, the farmer disarmed each of the traps. The message was clear. The threat was escalating from intimidation to real violence. When Saturday came again, Tony hesitated to go to the market. The idea of leaving the farm unprotected worried him. On the other hand, he needed to sell his products to survive, and perhaps more importantly, he needed contact with other people now. After lengthy consideration, he decided to go, but departed later and planned to return earlier than usual. In the town square, he immediately noticed that something had changed. People looked at him differently, some with evident sympathy, others with poorly disguised curiosity. Mrs. Connie quickly came to meet him. "The goat story has become a legend around here," she spoke slowly so he could understand. "Everyone is talking about how Whisper stood up to that stuck-up businessman." Tony sketched a small smile, caressing Whisper's head, who seemed to perfectly understand that he was the center of attention. The market was proceeding normally when a woman he had never seen before approached his stall. She was tall, with dark hair tied in a simple bun, and wore practical clothes that contrasted with the natural elegance of her movements. She carried a professional camera hanging from her neck and a notebook in her hand. "Hello, you must be Tony," she said, articulating each word clearly, like someone accustomed to communicating with deaf people. "My name is Isabel Morgan. I'm a social worker, and I'm documenting traditional ways of life in Virginia." Tony observed her with caution. In recent days, he had learned to distrust strangers, but there was something genuine in that woman's gaze, a sincerity that intrigued him. "I've heard about you and your work with organic agriculture," she continued, maintaining constant eye contact. "I would very much like to visit your farm and document your daily life, if you permit." He hesitated, pondering the request. Whisper, normally distrustful of strangers, approached Isabel and sniffed her extended hand, an unusual behavior that didn't go unnoticed by Tony. After a few moments of reflection, he slowly nodded. He took a piece of paper from his market bag and wrote in neat handwriting, "Tomorrow after lunch, bring ID." Isabel smiled, a smile that illuminated her face in a surprising way. "Thank you for your trust," she replied. "I'll be there punctually." Next day, as promised, Isabel arrived at Good Hope Farm. She came driving a small, compact car, dressed in jeans, appropriate hiking boots, and a long-sleeved shirt that protected her from the strong mountain sun. She brought her camera, the notebook, and a folder with documents that proved her identity and affiliation with a state university project. Tony, who waited for her on the porch, examined the papers carefully before inviting her in. Isabel smiled when she noticed Whisper strategically positioned beside his owner, like a furry and vigilant bodyguard. "He really doesn't leave your side, does he?" she commented, as she followed Tony through the simple but impeccably organized interior of the house. The afternoon passed in a surprisingly pleasant manner. Isabel demonstrated genuine respect for Tony's space and rhythms. She didn't interrupt his tasks, only observed and documented with discretion. Occasionally she asked questions, always facing him, clearly articulating the words. To Tony's surprise, she also knew some basic signs of ASL, American Sign Language, which tremendously facilitated communication between them. When her sign vocabulary was exhausted, they resorted to writing or lip reading. "I learned a bit when I worked with the deaf. Community in Richmond," she explained, "but I confess I still have much to learn." As the day progressed, Tony felt an invisible barrier dissolving. There was something in Isabel's presence that brought a long-forgotten calmness. Perhaps it was the way she truly saw him, not as the deaf man of the mountain, but as a man with valuable knowledge, important traditions, and a deep connection to the land. During the tour of the property, however, Isabel noticed the signs of intrusion that Tony had been trying to disguise. A damaged fence here, boot marks there, a recently disturbed garden bed. Her trained eye caught every detail. "Tony, is something happening here?" she asked directly when they returned to the house for coffee. He hesitated, but something in Isabel's genuinely concerned expression made him change his mind. He went to a drawer and removed the threatening notes he had been collecting. He handed them to her, carefully observing her reaction. Isabel read each one, her expression transforming from concern to indignation. "This is criminal intimidation," she said finally, looking him in the eyes. "Do you have any idea who might be behind this?" Tony took a piece of paper and wrote just one name, Roger Blackwood. Isabel frowned, the name clearly triggering an alert in her professional mind. "The luxury construction businessman?" she asked, receiving an affirmative nod in response. "That makes sense, but why would he be so interested in this specific farm?" The question hung in the air like the mist that frequently covered the mountains at dawn. It was the same question that had tormented Tony in the sleepless nights of the past week. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky with orange hues, Isabel prepared to depart. On the porch, she turned to Tony with a determined expression. "May I come back tomorrow?" she asked. "I'd like to continue documenting your work, and I also think we can find out what's happening here." Tony nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. For the first time in days, he didn't feel completely alone in that silent battle. Isabel Morgan had entered his life like a ray of hope amid the forming storm. In the weeks that followed, Isabel's presence became constant at Good Hope Farm. What had begun as an academic documentation project was gradually transforming into something deeper. The social worker came almost daily, always with her camera and notebook, but now also bringing newspaper clippings, official documents, and an increasingly determined look. On a particularly hot afternoon, while Tony worked on cheese production, Isabel sat at the kitchen table, spreading papers around her. "I've been researching Roger Blackwood," she said, when she caught Tony's curious look. "The man has a questionable business history throughout the region. Always the same pattern. He acquires land in locations with tourism potential, builds luxury developments and sells to foreign investors." Tony dried his hands on his apron and approached the table. Among the documents, he recognized a detailed map of the Stone Creek region, with Good Hope Farm highlighted in red. Isabel pointed to the map. "Your property is strategically located. It's the highest point in the region, with the best view of the valley, and has access to a road that facilitates transportation. From a real estate perspective, it's a perfect area for a luxury condominium." Tony slowly nodded. The explanation made sense, but something still bothered him. If it was just for the location, Why so much aggression in the approaches? There were other properties with similar characteristics in the surroundings. As if reading his thoughts, Isabel continued. But I think there's something more. She hesitated, biting her lower lip. I need to verify some information with the State Environmental Department. Do you mind if I take more photos of the property today, especially the northern area near the spring? Tony agreed, intrigued by the direction the investigation was taking. While he finished the cheese production, he observed Isabel through the window walking around the property, photographing details that seemed insignificant. Rock formations, vegetation patterns, the watercourse that cut through the farm. Whisper, as always, attentively followed each of Tony's movements. In recent days, the goat demonstrated an even more protective behavior, rarely moving away, especially when Tony worked in the more isolated corners of the property. It was during that same afternoon that the episode that would change everything occurred. Tony was in the middle of the plantation, examining the growth of the vegetables when Whisper, who was peacefully grazing a few meters ahead, suddenly raised his head and fixed his gaze in the direction of the forest. His ears moved forward, body tense, nostrils dilated. Isabel, who was photographing the horizon a few meters away, captured the unusual movement and instinctively directed the camera toward the goat. She recorded the exact moment when Whisper ran toward Tony, interrupting him with insistent headbutts to his hip, as if trying to push him away from that location. Confused, Tony tried to calm the animal, but Whisper was unyielding. He continued pushing until, finally, the farmer yielded and began to move away. They hadn't walked more than 20 meters when a thunderous sound shook the air. An old tree collapsed exactly where Tony had been seconds before. Isabel, who had captured the entire sequence on video, ran to them, her face pale with shock. "My God, Tony, that tree could have fallen on you," she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting that he couldn't hear her. Upon examining the fallen trunk, they discovered recent marks of partial cutting at the base. Someone had deliberately weakened the tree, creating a deadly trap that only didn't work thanks to Whisper's instinct. With trembling hands, Isabel showed Tony the video she had just recorded. Whisper alerting, interrupting his work, saving him from disaster. The farmer hugged the animal, moved, while Isabel continued filming, capturing that moment of deep connection between man and beast. That night, in her small apartment in town, Isabel couldn't get the images she had witnessed out of her head. After lengthy reflection, she made a decision that would change the course of events. She edited the video of Whisper saving Tony, added explanatory captions about the situation at Good Hope Farm and the threats its owner had been receiving, and published it on social media with the hashtag #TheGuardianGoat. It's a risk, but we need visibility, she murmured to herself as she clicked Publish. What happened in the following 24 hours surprised even Isabel, accustomed to the power of social media in her profession. The video went viral instantly. The image of the goat alerting his deaf owner to imminent danger touched thousands of hearts. Emotional comments flooded the post, shares multiplied, and soon the hashtag #TheGuardianGoat was among the most discussed topics in the country. When Isabel arrived at the farm the next morning, she was greeted by a visibly confused Tony. He showed her the old cell phone he kept mainly for emergencies. The screen displayed dozens of support messages from unknown numbers. "I think we need to talk," said Isabel, leading him to the porch. Whisper has become a symbol of resistance overnight. With patience, she explained to him what she had done and showed him the repercussion. The video had already surpassed 500,000 views, and several TV stations and newspapers had contacted her requesting interviews. Tony shook his head, a mixture of surprise and apprehension in his gaze. He took a paper and wrote, "This could make things worse." Isabel sighed, understanding his concern. "Or it could be our best protection," she replied. "Now everyone is watching. Anything that happens to you or to the farm won't go unnoticed." As they conversed, an unknown car parked at the farm gate. A young reporter and a cameraman got out, looking around with evident interest. "And so it begins," murmured Isabel, gently squeezing Tony's arm. "Let's face this together. Trust me." Whisper, as if understanding the importance of the moment, positioned himself between Tony and the visitors, raising his head with dignity. The goat that had once been rescued, tangled in barbed wire, now became the guardian not just of a man, but of a cause that was beginning to echo far beyond the mountains of Virginia. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We'll continue. The transformation of Good Hope Farm in the following weeks was extraordinary. What was once a silent refuge in the mountains became the stage for constant movement. Journalists, environmental activists, curious visitors, everyone wanted to meet Tony and the famous guardian goat that had conquered the heart of America. Tony, naturally reserved, now found himself at the center of attention he never desired. Only the constant presence of Isabel, translating and mediating interactions, made the situation bearable. She had become not just his interpreter, but a fierce protector of his privacy and dignity. "Only 5 more minutes," she said firmly to an insistent reporter from a national network. "And remember, no flashes, no questions about his childhood, and no requests for Whisper to perform tricks." Amid the commotion, Isabel hadn't lost sight of the main objective, discovering the true reason for Roger Blackwood's interest in the property. One afternoon, while Tony reluctantly granted an interview to a documentarist, she received a call that made her heart race. "Hello, Isabel. This is Richard from the State Water Resources Department. I have the information you requested about Good Hope Farm." She quickly moved away, seeking a more private. "The location." "Richard, thank you for getting back to me. What did you discover?" "Well, you were right to suspect. We just completed a full mapping of the water resources of Stone Creek Ridge, and the results are impressive. Good Hope Farm is literally sitting on one of the purest and most abundant aquifers ever documented in Virginia. We're talking about a mineral water spring with extraordinary quality and volume." Isabel felt a chill run down her spine. Everything was beginning to make sense. "Is this public information?" she asked, already imagining the answer. "Officially, the report will only be published next month, but—" Richard hesitated. "Some people have early access to this information, people with the right connections." "People like Roger Blackwood," Isabel completed, not as a question but as a statement. "I can't confirm that, but—" Another moment of hesitation. "Let's say it wouldn't be surprising." After hanging up, Isabel remained still for a few minutes, processing the revelation. The luxury condominium was just a facade. Blackwood's true interest was the water, an increasingly valuable resource in times of climate crisis. By controlling the spring, he would control not just a lucrative mineral water business, but potentially the water supply for the entire region. When she finally returned to Tony, she found him visibly exhausted after the long interview. With gentle gestures, she indicated that they needed to talk privately. Whisper, as usual, followed them to the kitchen, positioning himself vigilantly near the door. "Tony, I discovered why Blackwood wants your farm so badly," she began, making sure he could clearly see her lips. "It's not for the view, nor for the location for construction. It's for the water." She explained the discovery in detail, showing him maps and documents on her tablet. Tony listened with a grave expression, occasionally nodding to indicate he understood. When she finished, he took a paper and wrote, "My grandfather always said our water was special. He called it the soul of the mountain." Isabel smiled, touched by the ancient wisdom that often proved more insightful than modern studies. "We need to make this public," she said. "It's the best protection against Blackwood's threats. If everyone knows the true environmental value of this land, it will be much harder for him to act in the shadows." Tony slowly nodded, although his gaze revealed concern. He wrote again, "He will be furious." "Probably," Isabel agreed. "But now you're not alone in this fight." The plan was put into action immediately. Using the visibility that Whisper had gained, Isabel organized an improvised press conference at the farm for the following day. Journalists from across the country were invited for an important revelation about the guardian goat case. That night, as the final preparations were made, Tony sat on the porch, observing the stars with Whisper lying at his feet. The peace of the night dramatically contrasted with the storm approaching in their lives. Even so, there was a strange tranquility in his heart, the certainty of one who knows that, regardless of the outcome, he is fighting for what is right. Isabel, who was checking some final details on her laptop in the living room, came to join him on the porch. She sat silently in the rocking chair beside him, respecting the contemplative moment. After a few minutes, Tony turned to her and signed something he had recently learned in sign language. "Thank you." The simple gesture contained a depth that written words could never express. Isabel smiled, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "You don't need to thank me," she replied, articulating clearly. "Some battles need to be fought, no matter the price." The dawn brought the sound of rain, the typical summer shower of the Virginia mountains. Tony was sleeping deeply when Whisper began to agitate at the foot of his bed. The animal emitted sounds of distress, moving restlessly in circles. Awakened by the unusual agitation, Tony sat up, alert. It was then that he noticed a strange brightness coming from outside, a light that pulsated, too intense to be just lightning. He got up quickly and approached the window. What he saw froze his blood. 3 hooded men advancing across the yard, carrying flashlights and what looked like fuel cans. One of them was already near the barn, while the other 2 were heading toward the main house. Tony instinctively backed away. His first thought was of Isabel, sleeping in the guest room. He needed to alert her. Whisper, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, ran ahead, guiding Tony through the dark corridor to the room where the social worker rested. The farmer knocked firmly on the door, hoping the vibration would be enough to wake her. Seconds later, Isabel opened the door, sleepy and confused. One look at Tony's alarmed face and at the agitated Whisper was enough to understand that something was seriously wrong. "What is it?" she asked automatically, momentarily forgetting that he couldn't hear. Tony made quick gestures indicating people outside and danger. Isabel immediately grabbed her cell phone from the bedside table. "I'm going to call the police," she said, quickly dialing. "Stay away from the windows." While she spoke hurriedly on the phone, Tony returned to his room to get the only weapon he owned, an old hunting shotgun that had belonged to his father. He had never used it, except to scare off occasional predatory animals, but its mere presence could be a deterrent factor. Back in the living room, he positioned himself strategically, away from the windows, but with a view of the yard. Whisper remained restless, moving between Tony and Isabel as if trying to protect them both. It was then they smelled it. Smoke. Thin at first, but quickly becoming denser. The intruders had started a fire. The orange light of the flames began to illuminate the yard, revealing the extent of the danger they faced. The fire that was beginning to consume the barn lit up the night like a dark omen. Inside the house, Tony and Isabel sought a safe exit, while Whisper remained restless, sniffing the smoke-laden air. "The police are on their way," Isabel informed him, gesturing so Tony could understand. "But it will take at least 20 minutes for them to arrive from town. We need to buy time." The distant sound of an engine cut through the night. It wasn't the intruders leaving, but new vehicles arriving. Through the window, they saw 2 cars hurriedly parking by the gate. From the first, 3 men jumped out with buckets and fire extinguishers. From the second, to Isabel's surprise, emerged some familiar faces, neighbors from the area who had followed Tony's story in recent weeks. "It's your neighbors," she exclaimed, her face lighting up with hope. "They've come to help." In a matter of minutes, a human chain formed between the house and the well, with buckets passing from hand to combat the fire in the barn. The intruders, realizing they were no longer alone, quickly fled into the darkness of the woods, leaving behind their unfinished, destructive work. Tony observed the scene with contained emotion. These people, many of whom he only knew from greetings at the market, were risking themselves in the middle of the night to protect his property. The feeling of isolation he had carried for so many years slowly dissolved before this demonstration of solidarity. With the fire under control and the damage assessed, fortunately limited to the external structure of the barn and some tools, the police finally arrived. Statements were taken, evidence photographed, and a patrol was promised for the remainder of the night. Isabel served coffee to everyone, naturally establishing herself as Tony's spokesperson among the crowd of rescuers and authorities. When, finally, the last neighbors said goodbye and the police departed, it was almost 5 in the morning. The sky was beginning to lighten on the horizon, promising a new day. Exhausted, Tony and Isabel sat on the porch, Whisper vigilant at their feet. "We need to rethink our strategy," said Isabel, after a long silence. "The press conference needs to happen as soon as possible. Blackwood is getting desperate, and that makes him even more dangerous." Tony nodded gravely. He took his notepad and wrote, "He won't give up easily." "No, he won't," she agreed. "But now we have something he doesn't have: public support. People are on your side, Tony, and that makes all the difference." The new day brought frantic activity to Good Hope Farm. Journalists arrived early, attracted by the news of the criminal fire that was already circulating on social media. Isabel, efficient as always, transformed adversity into opportunity, moving the press conference up to that very morning. Under the shade of a large tree in the yard, a small stage was improvised. Microphones were installed, cameras positioned, and a heterogeneous audience formed. Reporters, environmentalists, local residents, and even some tourists who were in the region and wanted to witness the event. Isabel opened the session with a brief contextualization of the case, narrating the story of Tony, Whisper's arrival, and the growing threats from Roger Blackwood. Then, she revealed the discovery that changed everything. The real interest in Good Hope Farm is not its privileged location or tourism potential. "It's this," she said, raising a glass vial containing crystalline water. "The farm sits on one of the purest and most abundant aquifers ever documented in Virginia, a mineral water source of incalculable value in times of water crisis." A murmur ran through the audience. Cameras clicked incessantly, capturing the serene expression of Tony beside Isabel, with Whisper faithfully posted between the two. Official documents from the State Water Resources Department, which will be officially published, next month confirm the extraordinary potential of this spring, she continued, displaying graphs and maps on an improvised screen. Mr. Blackwood's supposed real estate project would just be a facade for the commercial exploitation of this water, potentially compromising the supply for the entire region. Questions exploded from all sides. Isabel answered precisely, occasionally translating for Tony when the question was directed specifically to him. The farmer, unaccustomed to such exposure, maintained a silent dignity that impressed everyone. The press conference was about to end when a black car, identical to the one Roger Blackwood had used in his visit to the market, parked near the location. All eyes turned to the vehicle, while a tense silence established itself. To everyone's surprise, who got out was not the businessman, but a young man who appeared to be no more than 30. Tall, with dark, well-cut hair, he wore simple clothes that contrasted with the luxury of the automobile. His face, though bearing undeniable similarities to Roger's, displayed a very different expression, determined, but without the characteristic arrogance of the businessman. "My name is Cameron Blackwood," he announced, approaching the center of attention. "I am Roger Blackwood's son, and I have something important to contribute to this discussion." Isabel tensed, instinctively placing herself closer to Tony. Whisper, surprisingly, did not demonstrate the usual distrust, just observing the newcomer with attention. "I haven't come to defend my father," continued Cameron to everyone's relief. "On the contrary, I've come to expose the complete truth about his plans for this property." From inside a leather folder, he removed various documents, handing them to Isabel. They were detailed projects, financial analyses, confidential emails, an entire dossier revealing not just the intention to commercially exploit the water, but also strategies to circumvent environmental legislation and bribe local authorities. "My father doesn't know I'm here," explained Cameron, while Isabel quickly examined the papers, her face expressing growing incredulity. "We've always disagreed about business methods, but this time he went too far. I can no longer be a silent accomplice." A journalist asked the obvious, "Why are you doing this? You're betraying your own family." Cameron smiled sadly. "I don't see it that way. I believe I'm honoring values that my mother tried to teach me before she passed away." He hesitated on the last word. Besides, some things are bigger than family ties. The preservation of this aquifer is not just a local issue, it's part of a much greater responsibility to the future. Tony, who was attentively observing the young man, stood up and approached him. The two men looked at each other for a moment, a silence loaded with meaning hanging between them. Then, to everyone's surprise, the farmer extended his hand in a gesture of thanks. Cameron shook it firmly, the simple contact sealing an unlikely alliance between the heir of the Blackwood Empire and the man his father had tried to intimidate and expel. Whisper, as if to add his approval to the scene, approached Cameron and allowed him to briefly pet his head, an honor that the animal rarely granted to strangers. In that moment, captured by dozens of cameras and destined to become the symbol of a resistance that transcended social barriers, a new phase was born in the fight for Good Hope Farm, a phase in which David was no longer alone against Goliath. The days following Cameron Blackwood's revelation transformed Stone Creek into a bustling town. The small community, previously known only for its esoteric tourism and natural beauty, had become the epicenter of a story that captured national attention: the struggle of a deaf farmer and his guardian goat against the greed of a powerful businessman. The documents provided by Cameron triggered an official investigation. Roger Blackwood was summoned to provide clarification, while his projects in the region were temporarily suspended. The businessman, accustomed to operating in the shadows and buying his way through obstacles, now faced the relentless court of public opinion. At Good Hope Farm, a cautious tranquility began to establish itself. With the constant presence of reporters and the vigilance organized by neighbors, the direct threats had ceased. Tony gradually resumed his routine, although nothing was exactly as before. On a sunny morning, while working on rebuilding the barn damaged by the fire, he received an unexpected visit. An official state government car drove up the dirt road, raising dust as it passed. From it emerged three people: a representative from the Department of Environment, a public prosecutor, and to his surprise, the mayor of Stone Creek. Isabel, who had been spending more and more time at the farm, received the visitors on the porch. Whisper, as always, remained vigilant near. Tony, his attentive gaze following the newcomers. "We've come to bring an official proposal," announced the state representative after the formal introductions. "The government wants to begin the process of designating Good Hope Farm as an environmental and cultural heritage site." The news was received with expressions of surprise and relief. The designation would mean legal protection against any future attempt at commercial exploitation of the land or its aquifer. The farm would be preserved for future generations, keeping its environmental value intact. "The only condition," continued the representative, "is that the farm be partially open to public visitation for educational purposes about environmental preservation and sustainable management of water resources." Tony heard the proposal, translated by Isabel with a thoughtful expression. After a few moments of reflection, he took his notepad and wrote a single question: "Will I continue to own the land?" "Absolutely," assured the prosecutor. "The designation doesn't alter ownership. It only restricts certain activities and ensures preservation. You will continue to be the owner and manager of the farm, just with the commitment to preserve it in its natural condition." A discreet smile appeared on Tony's usually serious face. He wrote again, "Then I accept." The agreement was sealed with handshakes and promises that the bureaucratic procedures would be expedited. When the visitors departed, Tony turned to Isabel, his eyes conveying a gratitude that words, written or spoken, could never adequately express. "You did it, Tony," she said, smiling. "Your land is safe." He shook his head negatively and pointed to her to Whisper, and then opened his arms encompassing the distance, indicating all who had contributed. The message was clear. The victory wasn't just his, but of an entire community that had united around a just cause. That afternoon, while Isabel organized the details for the future educational center that would be established on the farm, Tony received another surprising visit. Cameron Blackwood appeared alone, driving a simpler vehicle than the luxurious car associated with the family. The young man seemed different, lighter, despite the dark circles that betrayed sleepless nights. The events of the past weeks had not been easy for him, The public rupture with his father, the veiled threats of being disinherited, the media pressure, all of this had taken its toll. Tony invited him for coffee on the porch, the place where so many changes in his life had begun. Whisper, recognizing the visitor, approached calmly, allowing Cameron to pet him. "My father left the country yesterday," informed Cameron after Isabel joined them. "He went abroad on business, but we all know he's fleeing the investigations. He probably won't be back anytime soon." The news was received with a mixture of relief and concern. Roger Blackwood's absence reduced the immediate threat, but everyone knew that men like him rarely gave up on their objectives. "And what about you?" asked Isabel. "What do you intend to do now?" Cameron contemplated the mountain landscape for a few moments before responding. "I'm rethinking many things," he said finally. "Maybe it's time to use the family resources for something more constructive than accumulating profits. I'm considering establishing a foundation dedicated to water resource preservation." The conversation flowed naturally as the afternoon sun gilded the farm fields. When Cameron finally said goodbye, he left behind not just new allies but the beginning of an unlikely friendship born from conflict. Weeks turned into months. Good Hope Farm gradually adapted to its new reality. A small structure was erected near the main entrance, where visitors could learn about the importance of the aquifer and the traditional methods of sustainable agriculture practiced by Tony. Isabel, who had initially come as a documentarian, found a greater purpose. She assumed the coordination of the educational project, dividing her time between the farm and her other professional commitments. Her presence became so constant that a room in the main house was officially converted into her permanent space. The relationship between her and Tony evolved silently, like everything in the farmer's life. There were no grand declarations or dramatic moments, just small daily gestures that built a deep connection. She perfected her knowledge of ASL. He occasionally left wildflowers on her work table. On an autumn afternoon, while they were organizing an exhibition about local flora for the educational center, Tony surprised Isabel by handing her a small package. Inside, she found a silver chain with a pendant in the shape of a water drop, sculpted from local stone. "It's beautiful, Tony," she said, moved. "What does it mean?" He wrote in his notepad. "The soul of the mountain, like you." The simple gesture said more than long declarations. Isabel allowed him to place the necklace around her neck, his rough but gentle hands softly brushing her skin. When their gazes met, there was no need for words or signs, just the mutual understanding of two souls that had found home in each other. Whisper, who was observing the scene from the door, emitted a soft bleat as if expressing approval. The goat, no longer as young as when he arrived tangled in barbed wire, remained as the faithful guardian of the farm and its inhabitants. His story with Tony had inspired a children's book about friendship and environmental protection, written by a visitor to the educational center and now used in schools throughout the country. The news about the Good Hope Farm aquifer eventually left the national headlines, replaced by new dramas and sensations. But in Stone Creek, the story lived on, becoming part of local folklore. Children grew up hearing about the deaf man and his guardian goat who saved the magic water of the mountains. On a particularly beautiful Sunday, when the Virginia sky displayed that impossible blue that seems hand-painted, Tony, Isabel, and Whisper walked around the property, inspecting the new native tree seedlings planted by students who regularly visited the center. They stopped near the mainspring, where the crystalline water emerged from the earth with serene force, beginning its journey through rocks and valleys. Seated side by side on an ancient stone, they observed the constant flow that, like life, followed its course regardless of the human dramas that unfolded on its banks. Tony took Isabel's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. With his other hand he caressed Whisper, who rested his head on his knee. In the shared silence there was a fullness that words could never capture, the certainty that, even in the most unlikely circumstances, it was possible to find family, purpose, and belonging. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. Good Hope Farm, with its simple house, its green fields, and its precious water, remained as a silent witness to a timeless truth. That true wealth was not in material possessions, but in the connections we form and the causes we choose to fight. For and so, without ever raising his voice, that deaf man, his dedicated companion, and the goat that had united them, had created something much greater than a farm, a living legacy, a story of resistance, a hope planted with roots deep enough to sustain future generations. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us what city you're watching from.